The desert is quiet tonight. The stars are spread across the sky, and the Nile flows softly under the silver moon. Its waters carry the memories of countless generations. And tonight, they carry us, too, back into the ancient world, back into the hidden life of the pharaohs of Egypt. Hello, my dear listener. Before we step into the shadows of the pyramids and the corridors of forgotten palaces, let me invite you to settle in. Perhaps you are already lying down, with your blanket drawn softly around you. Breathe deeply, and let the desert wind of ancient Egypt carry you into the story. Tonight, we explore the disturbing and fascinating lives of the pharaohs, rulers who were not merely kings, but gods walking among mortals. Their lives were glittering with gold and wrapped in mystery, yet also shadowed by fear, rituals, and expectations that no ordinary human could endure. The pharaoh as a god. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was not simply a political leader. He was the Horus in life and Osiris in death, an embodiment of divine order, or Ma'at. From the moment he placed the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon his head, he ceased to be a man. He became a bridge between heaven and earth, a living deity whose very breath was believed to sustain the Nile's floods and the rising of the sun. But with this godhood came a burden. Imagine living your entire life in public, where every movement, every word, every gesture was scrutinized for divine meaning. If the crops failed, it was the pharaoh who was blamed. If the sun was hidden by sandstorms, people whispered that their ruler had offended the gods. To maintain this illusion of perfection, pharaohs often hid their true selves. They wore heavy cosmetics, false beards, even the queens wore them in ceremonial times, and carried themselves in rigid poses that declared eternity. The images carved into temple walls show not individuals, but archetypes. Behind the painted mask of calm power, the pharaoh was often a lonely figure, crushed beneath expectation. Life in the palace. The pharaoh's palace was not simply a home. It was a stage. Built of mud brick and painted with brilliant colors, it shone like a miniature version of paradise. Columns painted to resemble papyrus stalks supported high roofs, and every surface gleamed with gold leaf, lapis lazuli, and polished alabaster. Yet within this beauty lay control. The pharaoh's schedule was dictated by ritual. At dawn, priests woke him with hymns and perfumed oils. His body was anointed as though he were already a statue. Servants painted his eyes with kohl, lined with black to ward off the glare of the desert sun, but also to mimic the god Horus himself. He dined on bread, honey, figs, roasted meats, and jars of imported wine, though not in solitude. Every meal was a ceremony, watched by courtier, priests, and guards. Even when he laughed, or pretended to laugh, scribes recorded it, for every act of the pharaoh was considered a message to the gods. The burden of blood. Pharaohs were expected to be perfect, but perfection was impossible for mortals. To preserve the bloodline of gods, royal families often turned inward. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters. A practice shocking to us today, yet, in their eyes, it preserved divine purity. But behind the temple walls, these unions often carried tragic consequences. Children born of such marriages were frail, ill, or short-lived. The golden mask of kingship hid a dynasty weakened by its own sacred rules. Behind the splendor of the throne room, there lingered whispers of deformity, sickness, and sorrow. And yet, no one dared speak openly. For to question the pharaoh was to question the order of the universe itself. Public glory, private fear. By day, the pharaoh paraded as a god. He appeared in processions, carried on gilded litters, his crown heavy with jewels, his staff gleaming with gold. Trumpets sounded, dancers twirled, incense filled the air. But by night, the palace walls echoed with another sound: fear. Assassination was a constant shadow. Courtiers plotted in silence, generals dreamed of power, and foreign enemies schemed. Even within his family, betrayal lurked. More than one pharaoh met a bloody end, poisoned at a feast, strangled in his sleep, or struck down in the dark. Thus, the same man who was honored as a god by the people often lived in terror of his own household. The splendor of the throne was gilded, yes, but beneath the gold lay sharp edges. Ritual and illusion. The pharaoh's life was carefully staged. Every action was part of an endless performance designed to convince the people that he was eternal. He performed rituals in the temples, offering bread and wine to statues of gods who were, in truth, only reflections of himself. For in a way, the pharaoh was the central actor in a grand play, one in which belief itself was the stage. He was required to remain youthful, even in old age. Artists carved him with strong arms, broad shoulders, unlined faces, and perfect posture. Yet many pharaohs grew sick, frail, and weary. Their spines curved, their teeth rotted, their bodies ached under the desert sun. Still, their statues never revealed weakness. The people saw a god. Behind the veil, there was only a man. A sleepy reflection. And so, as you drift deeper into rest, imagine the dual life of a pharaoh. Glorious, yet imprisoned. Divine, yet mortal. His face painted in eternal calm, while his heart beat with fear and longing. The desert winds whisper his secrets across the sands. The pyramids stand as his tombs, vast and eternal. But within them, only a fragile body remained, wrapped in linen, hidden from the world he once ruled. Close your eyes now, and let the silence of the Nile carry you deeper into dreams. For tonight, you have walked in the footsteps of a god who was only ever human. The desert night grows cooler now, my dear listener. The stars shine above the black line of the Nile, and the whisper of water carries us deeper into the secrets of the pharaohs. In the last chapter, we spoke of the divine mask of kingship, the godlike image every ruler of Egypt was forced to wear. Tonight, let us drift closer into the daily rhythms of their existence. For a pharaoh's life was woven not only of gold and power, but of rituals, luxuries, and pains he could never escape. The awakening of a god. At dawn, when the sun rose as Ra's fiery bark across the eastern sky, the pharaoh's body was stirred awake by priests. He was not allowed to rise as an ordinary man might, stretching, yawning, or rubbing tired eyes. Instead, he was woken as a god. Incense burned beside his bed. Soft chants filled the chamber. Priests anointed his skin with sacred oils, and his eyes were painted anew with kohl, black as the feathers of Horus. His hair was combed and scented, often hidden beneath ornate crowns or headdresses. The first breath of the day was not his own. It was ritualized, captured by chants and gestures meant to assure the people that the sun itself had risen because their ruler lived. Yet imagine the weight of this. To never wake as yourself, but always as a symbol. To have no private mourning, no sleepy stumble to the water, no quiet moment of solitude. Every sunrise was performance. food of the divine. When he ate, the pharaoh dined not merely as a man, but as an immortal. His meals were offerings, both to the gods and to his own body, which was believed to carry divine essence. Tables groaned under roasted ducks and geese, baskets of figs, dates, and pomegranates, honey dripping from combs, and loaves of bread baked from the finest white flour. There were jars of beer, and for the wealthiest courts, imported wines from the Levant. But such abundance carried shadows. Many pharaohs suffered from tooth decay and obesity. Studies of their mummies reveal worn teeth, abscesses, and hardened arteries. Luxuries that were meant to demonstrate divine favor often brought earthly suffering. And though his subjects might imagine their ruler eating joyfully among his treasures, the pharaoh's meals were rarely private. Courtiers, guards, and scribes stood nearby, watching every gesture, ready to record his words. Even at the table, he was not a man. He was a living ritual. The rituals of rule. Beyond his meals and mornings, the pharaoh's day was filled with sacred duties. Each action was designed to uphold Ma'at, the divine balance of the universe. He visited temples, where he alone entered the innermost chambers. There, before statues of the gods, he made offerings: bread, beer, incense, oils. He rang sistrums, poured libations, and chanted hymns, not for himself, but for all of Egypt. In truth, the pharaoh did not always perform these rites personally. Priests often stood in his place, dressed in the royal garments, speaking his words. Yet the illusion remained that the king himself carried out every act, that his hands were the ones offering bread to Amun, Ra, or Hathor. His afternoons were filled with councils, judgments, and audiences. Foreign envoys prostrated themselves before him, kissing the ground, unable to look upon his face. His courtiers bowed deeply, for to stand equal with a god was unthinkable. And still, behind this endless ceremony, he was human, tired, restless, perhaps aching in his bones, but never allowed to show it. Luxury and loneliness. By evening, when the palace halls glowed with torchlight, the pharaoh retreated to chambers gilded with gold. His walls were painted with hunting scenes, lotus flowers, and starry skies. Perfumed oils scented the air. Musicians played harps and flutes, and dancers swayed in candlelight. Yet, within this world of splendor lay loneliness. Few dared speak to the pharaoh as a man. Wives, concubines, and children surrounded him, yet even they approached with ritual. Every touch was political, every glance observed. He could summon the most beautiful entertainers in Egypt, but genuine love, untainted by fear or ambition, was rare. For who can truly love a god when the god is also a prisoner? The body in pain. For all their wealth, the pharaohs were not spared the sufferings of flesh. The dry Egyptian diet wore down their teeth until they cracked and bled. Arthritis stiffened their joints from years of ceremonial postures and processions. Malaria, parasites, and infections plagued their bodies. Some pharaohs limped, others were nearly blind, and some, like Akhenaten, may have suffered from deformities or genetic illness. Yet statues always showed them strong, youthful, and eternal. The reality of pain was hidden beneath the illusion of perfection, and when the suffering grew too great, priests turned to spells, amulets, and rituals rather than medicine. For their ruler was not a patient. They treated him as a sacred vessel, a living shrine to the gods. Night in the palace. As the moon rose, the pharaoh withdrew deeper into secrecy. Guards lined his corridors, carrying spears and torches. Assassination was a constant threat. More than one king had died within palace walls. Perhaps he lay awake on a golden bed, staring into darkness, wondering which courtier plotted against him, which general dreamed of the throne, which wife whispered to a lover in the shadows. For while his subjects imagined their ruler resting in eternal peace, in truth, he was often restless, imprisoned by his own crown. The Nile lies quiet under the silver moon, and so must we, dear listener. Tonight, let us drift deeper into the secret chambers of the pharaohs. Not the temples, not the throne room, but the world of love, desire, and betrayal. For though they were gods on earth, pharaohs could never love freely. Even in matters of the heart, they were prisoners of duty. Marriage as politics. To marry as a pharaoh was never a choice of passion. It was a matter of politics and survival. The king often married his own sister or daughter, a custom meant to preserve the sacred bloodline of the gods. To outsiders, this may seem disturbing, yet in ancient Egypt, it was considered divine. The gods themselves, Osiris and Isis, were siblings and lovers. So too, the pharaoh mirrored this union, binding heaven's myth to the earth. But such unions rarely brought happiness. A young bride might tremble before her brother, her father, or even her grandfather, knowing her body was part of the kingdom's ritual. Love was not hers to choose. Beyond the royal family, pharaohs often married foreign princesses to secure alliances. Syrian, Nubian, and Hittite daughters were sent across deserts as gifts of peace. Some were cherished, others forgotten in the shadowed halls of harems. Their names were rarely remembered, their voices lost in history. The harem and the concubines. The pharaoh's palace held harems filled with wives and concubines, each competing for favor. Music, laughter, and whispered rivalries floated through these gilded prisons. For to catch the pharaoh's eye was to gain power, not only for a woman herself, but for her family, her brothers, her tribe. Yet the harem was also a dangerous place. Jealousies could grow sharp as daggers. Poisoned cups of wine, rumors whispered into the pharaoh's ear, rivalries ending in silence. Archaeologists uncovered letters and papyrus scrolls where even queens begged the pharaoh not to abandon them for another. Imagine the unease of those nights, the pharaoh reclining on silken cushions, surrounded by dancers, yet never knowing which smile hid envy, which kiss carried betrayal. Love that was forbidden. But what of true love? Did pharaohs ever feel it? Some did. There were pharaohs who cherished a single queen above all others, raising her beside them as near equals. Nefertiti, with her radiant beauty, stood beside Akhenaten in every temple, her face carved into stone, as though she were a goddess herself. And yet, such devotion could be dangerous. If a pharaoh favored one woman too much, others in the court grew restless. Enemies whispered, brothers and generals plotted. A pharaoh who loved too deeply risked the stability of his throne. For love, in Egypt's palaces, was a threat. Betrayals of blood. Worse still were the betrayals that came not from wives, but from family. Brothers plotted against brothers, sons against fathers. A mother might scheme to place her child upon the throne, weaving conspiracies through the harem. One pharaoh could trust no one, not even those who shared his blood. The harem conspiracy of Pharaoh Ramses III is one of the most chilling. His secondary wife, Tai, sought to place her son on the throne. She plotted with scribes, generals, and servants. Together, they planned to murder the king. The attempt failed, yet Ramses was wounded, and the conspirators faced horrific trials. Wives and children were executed for daring to touch the divine body of the pharaoh. Behind the gold and incense, the royal chambers were haunted with whispers of betrayal, the loneliness of desire. And so, even surrounded by beauty, the pharaoh's heart was often empty. He could command armies, raise monuments of stone, and bend nations to his will. But he could not command love. Every embrace was shadowed by politics. Every marriage was sealed by duty. Every whisper of passion was tainted with fear. The man beneath the crown, lonely, weary, could only dream of love unchained, whispering to sleep. As you drift now toward your own dreams, imagine the pharaoh's heart, heavy with gold, yet aching with longing, surrounded by wives, yet starved of affection, powerful enough to build pyramids, yet powerless against his own loneliness. The night hides many secrets, and in the quiet of the palace, the pharaoh's sighs mingled with the desert wind. Rest now, dear listener, and let these shadows fade into the softness of sleep. For tomorrow, we shall follow him into the darker chambers of death itself, the tombs, the curses, the endless quest for eternity. The desert night grows colder now, dear listener, and the stars above Egypt shimmer like tiny flames. It is time to follow the pharaoh, not in life, but in death, into the shadows of his tomb, where silence and eternity meet. The pharaoh and death. For the pharaoh, death was never an end. It was a passage. He was born a god, ruled as a god, and expected to live forever as one. But immortality required preparation. From the day he took the throne, the pharaoh's mind turned toward his tomb. His armies marched, his laborers toiled, and his priests chanted, all so that when his heart beat its last, his soul might rise into the eternal fields of paradise. And so, his tomb became his obsession. The building of eternity, pyramids, temples, secret chambers carved into cliffs, all were monuments to a single man's fear of being forgotten. Tens of thousands of workers hauled stone beneath the burning sun, their sweat and blood soaking the desert sands. Architects whispered calculations, priests traced sacred symbols, and guards ensured no word of the tomb's secrets escaped. In the Valley of the Kings, tunnels twisted deep into the earth. Walls were painted with stars, boats, gods and spells. Hieroglyphs promised the pharaoh safe passage, guiding him past demons, serpents, and gates of fire. Even his body was remade, organs removed, skin salted, flesh wrapped in linen, lips sealed with gold. The pharaoh became a mummy, a vessel of eternity. The ritual of the afterlife. When the final day came, priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony. They touched the mummy's lips with sacred tools so he might breathe again in the afterlife. Perfume and incense filled the tomb. Daughters wept, wives tore their robes, priests chanted prayers older than the pyramids. The pharaoh was carried down into his chamber, surrounded by treasures, thrones of ivory, weapons of bronze, necklaces of gold, jars of honey, even toys for his children. Everything he might need in paradise was buried with him. For they believed the dead lived again, walking through fields of reeds beneath an eternal sun, drinking from the Nile that flowed through heaven. The curse of the pharaohs. But with such wealth came danger. Grave robbers haunted the tombs. Even priests, sworn to protect, sometimes betrayed their masters, cutting open coffins and stealing jewels. To protect their kings, Egyptians whispered of curses, spells carved into the stone itself. "Death shall come on swift wings to he who disturbs the Pharaoh's rest," read one inscription. Perhaps it was only a warning. Yet, centuries later, when explorers opened tombs, strange accidents followed. Fires, fevers, sudden deaths. Lord Carnarvon, who helped uncover Tutankhamun's tomb, died mysteriously just months later, as newspapers whispered of the pharaoh's curse. Whether curse or coincidence, the tombs of Egypt remained places of unease. Even today, standing before those painted walls, one feels the weight of silence, as though the dead still watch. The pharaoh's fear. And yet, beneath the curses, beneath the gold, there was fear. For all their power, pharaohs were terrified of being forgotten, terrified that their names would vanish, their tombs would be broken, their souls would wander lost. That is why they built monuments larger than mountains. That is why they inscribed their names on every stone. They wanted eternity, but eternity was fragile. So close your eyes, dear listener, and imagine the tomb's silence, the flicker of a torch against painted walls, the still body of the pharaoh, wrapped in linen, crowned in gold, lying in the heart of the earth. The desert above is endless. The stars burn cold. And deep below, the pharaoh waits, forever. Drift now into your own dreams, where no curses linger, where sleep itself is a kind of eternity. Fading crowns, the slow disappearance of the pharaohs. The Nile drifts on, patient and eternal. But the kings who once claimed to be gods did not endure forever. Even the most powerful crown is still made of fragile gold. The waning of power. By the late New Kingdom, the pharaoh's strength began to fade. The empire stretched too far, wars drained the treasury, and priests of Amun grew so wealthy that sometimes they rivaled the pharaoh himself. Foreigners pressed at the borders, Hittites, Assyrians, Persians. Once Egypt was the heart of the world, its chariots feared, its temples gleaming. But centuries passed, and the desert swallowed its strength. Pharaohs became weaker. Some were mere children, placed on the throne like dolls. Others were manipulated by priests or generals. The people still bowed, still offered prayers, but the illusion of divinity had cracks. The changing face of kingship. Foreign rulers arrived. Nubian kings wore the double crown of Egypt. Persian emperors called themselves pharaohs. Later, even Alexander the Great, born far away in Macedon, stood before the temple priests and was declared the son of Ra. And so, the throne of Egypt became a costume, worn by strangers. The rituals remained, but the heart of the old kingdom had dimmed. Still, the people whispered the ancient prayers. Still, they buried their dead with amulets and spells. Tradition faded slowly, like the desert sun sinking beneath the horizon. Temples in shadow. The grand temples fell silent. Without pharaohs to command armies of workers, stone cracked, walls collapsed, and statues leaned into the sand. Priests struggled to keep the fires lit, but offerings dwindled. The gods, once fed with bread and wine, seemed hungry. Yet the Nile still flowed, and so life continued. Farmers planted, women sang, children played, while the monuments of eternity decayed around them. Close your eyes, dear listener, and imagine walking through those ruins in twilight. The hieroglyphs still shine faintly. The statues still stand proud. but the voices are gone. The gods are silent, and the Pharaoh's name is dust. I let my voice soften now, as though we are stepping into the fading light of an ancient Egyptian dusk. The pyramids already stood for thousands of years, weathered by desert winds, their stones holding the memories of ages. Yet, the Egypt of the late pharaohs was not the same Egypt that had birthed them. By the 4th century before the Common Era, Egypt was both proud and fragile, an old kingdom that still spoke the language of the gods, but no longer held the same breath of eternal power. When Alexander the Great entered Egypt in 332 BCE, he was received not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The Persian rulers who had dominated Egypt before him had been seen as distant, even hostile. Alexander, clever and ambitious, allowed the priests to proclaim him as Pharaoh, the son of Amun, and he visited the sacred oracle at Siwa Oasis to confirm his divine birth. For the people of Egypt, it seemed as though a new age of divinity had begun. Yet, Alexander did not stay long. His vast empire pulled him eastward, and Egypt was left in the hands of his general, Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic dynasty began here, in 305 BCE. These were not pharaohs born of Egypt's soil, but Greek rulers who wore Egyptian crowns. In the temples, they presented themselves as traditional pharaohs, depicted in hieroglyphs and carvings in the old divine style. They offered sacrifices to Isis, Horus, and Osiris. They upheld the sacred rituals of the Nile, presiding over festivals and honoring the gods of fertility and harvest. But in their palaces, they spoke Greek, lived in Greek fashion, and filled their libraries with the works of Homer, Plato, and Aristotle. It was a strange blending, this world where Egypt's oldest ceremonies were carried out by rulers who did not share the blood of Ramses or Tutankhamun. And yet, perhaps for that reason, the rituals took on an even more deliberate intensity. The priests became guardians of authenticity. They ensured that the coronation rites were performed with exact precision, that the offerings to the gods were given without fail. To the common people, little changed. The Nile still flooded. The temples still opened their gates. But under the surface, Egypt was slowly transforming. In the midst of this, one woman would rise, whose name still stirs whispers: Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic line, ruling from 51 BCE. She was, like her ancestors, of Macedonian Greek blood, but she embraced Egypt more fully than any of her predecessors. She learned the Egyptian language. She participated in Egyptian rituals, not as an act of politics alone, but with genuine reverence. Her image, carved on temple walls, shows her offering milk to the gods, crowned with the horned headdress of Hathor, a living embodiment of divine femininity. Yet Cleopatra's life was filled with turbulence. To hold her throne, she bound herself in alliances that shocked the old world. First with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. These unions, both political and romantic, became infamous in Roman history. In Egypt, though, she was still a pharaoh, a divine queen who represented the union of heaven and earth. To her people, she was the mother of the Nile, protector of fertility, the last guardian of the old ways. But Rome's shadow was too vast. After the death of Antony and Cleopatra in 30 BCE, Egypt was absorbed into the Roman Empire. For the first time in 3,000 years, Egypt no longer had its own pharaoh. And yet, the rituals did not disappear at once. Even under Roman rule, the priests continued their work. They mummified bodies, inscribed spells, and preserved the Book of the Dead. Egyptian farmers still left offerings to Osiris at the flood season. Women still wore fertility amulets of Bees and Tauray. The temples still echoed with prayers to Ra as the sun rose each day. But over time, change became inevitable. The emperors in Rome appointed governors to rule in place of a pharaoh. These governors did not undergo the divine coronation. The sacred marriage between ruler and goddess was left undone. Slowly, the sacred festivals lost their official splendor. By the 3rd century CE, Christianity began to spread across Egypt. The old gods were whispered less, and the crosses of a new faith appeared upon the stones. Still, even in their decline, the echoes of Egypt's ancient ceremonies survived. When a Roman emperor entered Egypt, he was sometimes still portrayed in pharaonic garb, shown on temple walls in the posture of offering gifts to the gods. It was as though the land itself insisted on remembering. Tonight, as we imagine this fading world, I picture the last torchlight processions in the Temple of Isis, the final chants in hieroglyphic script, the last coronation where priests crowned a ruler with the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. These moments lingered, fragile, like the last breath of a dream. The disturbing, divine life of the pharaohs had not ended. It had simply changed shape, waiting to be remembered. When I close my eyes now, I imagine the sound of a temple gate creaking in the desert wind. Sand drifts into the carved corridors where once thousands of feet had gathered for festivals. Torches that once lit processions now lie cold and forgotten. The voices of priests, once strong and commanding, fade into silence. This was the slow decline of the pharaoh's world. By the 2nd century of the Common Era, Egypt had been a province of Rome for generations. The emperors in Rome wore laurel crowns instead of the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. And though some still allowed themselves to be depicted in pharaonic style for tradition's sake, there was no longer a living pharaoh. The chain of divine kingship, stretching back more than 3,000 years, had been broken. In the cities, new customs took root. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, became a great center of learning. Here, Greek philosophy mingled with Egyptian magic, Roman law with Jewish scripture, and soon, Christian teaching as well. It was in this melting pot that the old gods first began to lose their voices. But it did not happen suddenly. For centuries, people continued to visit the temples of Isis, Hathor, and Osiris. Pilgrims brought offerings. Farmers left grain and milk at shrines. Young women prayed for fertility with amulets of Tauret or Bees. In village after village, the rhythm of life was still marked by rituals older than any empire. The goddess Isis, in particular, held on. Her cult spread far beyond Egypt, reaching Rome, Gaul, even Britain. She was no longer only an Egyptian mother goddess. She had become a universal protector. And yet, as Christianity grew, Isis's image slowly blurred into another mother figure, Mary, the Virgin. In some ways, Isis never truly vanished. She was simply transformed. The temples, however, could not resist forever. By the late 4th century, Christianity had become the official faith of the Roman Empire. The Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan temples in 391 CE. In Egypt, this decree struck deep. The great temple at Philae, sacred to Isis, was closed by force. Priests were driven out, and rituals that had endured for millennia were silenced. But the people remembered. Even after the temples were shuttered, villagers still whispered the old prayers. They carved protective symbols on doorways. They told stories of Osiris and Horus by lamplight, stories that mingled with new Christian parables. Tradition did not die. It changed its clothing, softened its voice, and learned to walk in secret. Centuries later, when Islam arrived in Egypt in the 7th century, another transformation began. Mosques rose where temples once stood. The call to prayer echoed across the Nile Valley, replacing the chants of the priests. Yet traces of the old ways remained hidden, like faint drawings under a painted wall. Egyptian Muslims, for centuries, kept small folk customs that echoed the time of the pharaohs. Charms for fertility, rituals at the river, the careful watching of stars for omens. The bones of the old world still lived beneath the skin of the new. And through it all, the pyramids stood, silent, immovable, watching. The people who once filled them with sacred purpose were long gone, but their presence lingered. Travelers from Greece, Rome, Arabia, and beyond would marvel at them. They did not know the exact rituals that had been performed inside, but they felt the weight of something ancient, something both disturbing and divine. As the centuries passed, the pharaohs became ghosts in their own land, no longer rulers, no longer living gods, but memories carved in stone and sand. Their mummies, once hidden in secret tombs to ensure eternal life, were unearthed by grave robbers or carried away to museums. Their names became subjects of study, not worship. Yet even now, as I whisper to you in the quiet of the night, I feel that those ancient rituals have not been fully lost. They echo in the ways we think about kingship, in the wedding rings we exchange, in the funerary prayers we still whisper to the dead. The disturbing, sacred life of the pharaohs still flows like the Nile, sometimes hidden underground, sometimes breaking the surface with a gleam. Close your eyes and imagine the last torch being extinguished in the temple of Isis. The smoke curling into the desert air, a silence descending that has lasted for over 1,000 years. But listen closer, and you may still hear the faintest chant of the priests, promising that nothing truly sacred ever disappears. When we look at the world around us, it is easy to imagine that the ancient lives of the pharaohs are far behind us, buried under sand and time. Yet in truth, so many of their customs still echo, though in the present, changed, softened, but never entirely erased. Take, for instance, the symbol of the wedding ring. In ancient Egypt, men and women exchanged rings made of reeds or braided hemp, later of precious metals. The circle represented eternity, an unbroken bond, and the placement on the ring finger of the left hand was no accident. Egyptians believed that a special vein, the vena amoris, ran from this finger directly to the heart. Today, millions of couples across the world repeat this silent Egyptian gesture when they slip rings onto one another's hands. Or think of makeup, that small daily ritual. The dark eyeliner, known as kohl, was worn by both men and women in Egypt, not only for beauty, but also for protection. They believed it shielded their eyes from the glare of the sun and from evil spirits. Even now, the fashion of eyeliner, mascara, and dramatic eye design owes a quiet debt to the painted eyes of Cleopatra and countless unknown queens before her. The pharaohs also lived with a constant awareness of omens, signs in the stars, the flight of birds, the way the Nile flooded. Today, while science governs much of our world, horoscopes and astrology still captivate millions. The Egyptian zodiac, with figures of the ram, the scarab, and the lion, blended later with Greek and Roman astrology, and survives in the star signs that people whisper about late at night. And what of funerary customs? The elaborate mummification rites of the Egyptians were designed to prepare the soul for eternity. While we no longer wrap the dead in linen and place them in pyramids, echoes remain in the way we dress the body, hold vigils, and bury loved ones with small tokens. The flowers placed in a coffin, the prayers whispered at gravesides, the careful attention to preserving dignity. These are distant descendants of pharaonic belief in life after death. Even the idea of sacred kingship has not fully vanished. The pharaohs were divine rulers, their authority linked to the gods themselves. In medieval Europe, kings and queens would adopt the notion of the divine right of kings, claiming that their power came not from men, but from heaven. Coronation rituals, crowns, thrones, anointing oils, carry shades of the ancient temple ceremonies of Egypt. To this day, monarchs are wrapped in ceremony that feels far older than their own nations. But perhaps the deepest survival lies in our fascination with eternity. The Egyptians built the pyramids not simply as tombs, but as eternal monuments, structures that would defy time. Even now, humanity chases the dream of leaving behind a legacy. Skyscrapers, monuments, even the way we record our voices and images on digital screens. These are our pyramids. We are still haunted by the same longing the pharaohs felt, to be remembered forever. When I whisper these truths to you, I feel how thin the line really is between past and present. Imagine a young woman today, standing in front of a mirror, applying dark eyeliner before a celebration. She does not know that she mirrors a queen of the Nile. Imagine a bride and groom exchanging rings in a quiet ceremony. Without realizing, they are repeating a custom older than Rome itself. Imagine the solemn hush at a funeral, when silence falls and every breath feels sacred, an echo of chants once heard in temples of Osiris. The disturbing lives of the pharaohs, their obsessions with death, magic, and the eternal, have not disappeared. They live in our habits, our rituals, and even our dreams. Their world is hidden, not gone. So when you next see a golden ring, a painted eye, or the slow march of a funeral procession, remember, you are closer to the pharaohs than you think. The ancient breath of the Nile still lingers in our lungs. And so, we arrive at the end of our long, quiet walk through the corridors of ancient Egypt. We have wandered through the dark chambers of the pyramids, followed the processions of kings and queens, and listened to the whispers of priests who once believed that every breath, every shadow, carried a trace of eternity. The lives of the pharaohs were grand and disturbing, filled with rituals of power, blood, and magic. Yet beneath all the gold and terror, there was always something deeply human, a longing to be remembered, to be loved, to never fade into silence. As I speak these final words to you, imagine the slow flow of the Nile at night, the water dark as ink, carrying reflections of stars that once guided farmers, soldiers, and scribes. Imagine a single flame flickering in a stone temple, where a priest whispers a prayer to Osiris for the safe passage of a soul. Imagine the pyramids standing in the desert, silent and immovable, while the sands shift endlessly around them. The pharaohs are gone. Their crowns are dust, their bodies wrapped in brittle linen, their names carved in crumbling hieroglyphs. But their voices have not been lost. They reach us still, in the customs we keep, the monuments we gaze upon, the quiet fascination we feel when we think of their world. And now, as you close your eyes, let those echoes soften. Let the noise of today fade, like distant footsteps swallowed by sand. Let your breath fall into the rhythm of the Nile, slow and steady. Let the ancient world slip back into the shadows where it belongs, while you drift gently into sleep. And so we drift deeper into the endless sands of time. The desert is quiet tonight, and the Nile flows gently, carrying with it the memories of countless generations. Pharaohs, men who were more than men, and yet not quite gods. Their lives were wrapped in ritual, in mystery, in the quiet weight of eternity. By day, their courts shimmered with gold. But gold can be heavy, and the crown even heavier. The pharaoh was not free. Every step he took, every breath he drew, was part of a performance, a sacred theater for the people of Egypt. At dawn, he was awakened by priests, not gently, not naturally, but through ceremony. The chamber would be filled with incense, the air heavy with frankincense and myrrh. Priests chanted softly, reminding the pharaoh that he was Ra's chosen, a living bridge between heaven and earth. Imagine opening your eyes not to silence, but to whispers of eternity, to the smoke of burning resin curling above your head. Meals were not simply food. They were rituals. A pharaoh could not eat alone, nor eat casually. Each dish, bread baked in clay ovens, honey dripping slowly from combs, fish freshly caught from the Nile, was tasted first by servants, not for flavor, but for safety. Every swallow of wine, every bite of pomegranate was a risk. Enemies lurked not just outside the palace walls, but sometimes within them. The pharaoh's family life was equally strange. Brothers and sisters were not always just family. They were expected to marry, to preserve divine blood. Affection in such marriages was rare. Duty ruled over love. Even the children, from the moment they were born, were weighed down by expectations. Tiny infants, wrapped in linen, already destined for titles, temples, and power struggles. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the silence. The palace, though vast, was full of listening ears. Servants, guards, scribes, always watching, always waiting. A pharaoh could never be alone. Even in his most private hours, there were witnesses. Scribes recording dreams, physicians checking his pulse, magicians whispering charms to protect him from unseen spirits. Nighttime, too, brought no peace. The pharaoh's sleep was guarded. Soldiers stood by the doors. Priests recited protective spells, and dreams themselves were not private. They were believed to be messages from the gods. Upon waking, the pharaoh had to speak them aloud, to be interpreted, recorded, and woven into the fabric of prophecy. Imagine that. Even your dreams, not your own. The pyramids, grand and eternal, were not just tombs. They were reminders. From the moment a pharaoh took the throne, preparations for his death began. Every festival he attended, every temple he built, was in some way a rehearsal for the afterlife. He lived with eternity pressing down on him, day after day. And so, the disturbing truth is this. Pharaohs, though worshipped as divine, were prisoners of their own divinity, bound not in chains of iron, but in chains of ritual, of expectation, of fear. Yet, through the silence of history, their shadows still walk among us. The echo of sandals on polished limestone floors, the rustle of linen robes, the faint fragrance of lotus flowers carried by the Nile breeze, all whisper of lives both magnificent and unbearably heavy. The palace of the pharaoh was more than stone and walls. It was a world within a world. Long corridors lined with painted reliefs, scenes of gods and battles frozen in time. Columns carved with lotus blossoms and papyrus reeds, painted in red, blue, and green. And always, the sound of sandals against polished floors, the low murmurs of priests, the flutter of palm fronds in the warm air. But inside this beauty, there was unease. Every visitor, every official, every relative might carry a hidden agenda. Poison slipped into wine, a dagger concealed beneath robes. Even words, spoken softly, could be weapons. The pharaoh's physicians were never far. They mixed herbs, mandrake, honey, garlic, each believed to hold power over illness or spirits. But even they could be both healers and spies. Trust was rare. At night, the pharaoh rested on a bed of carved ebony wood, draped with fine linen. Lamps flickered softly, fed with oil. Outside the chamber, guards remained awake, their spears gleaming faintly in the dim torchlight. But inside, the pharaoh could not escape his mind. The weight of rule pressed heavily. What if the Nile failed to flood this year? What if the people grew restless? What if the gods turned their faces away? The people saw a god. But inside, perhaps the pharaoh sometimes felt only human. Every year, great festivals bound his life to the cycle of the seasons. The Opet festival in Thebes, when the god Amun was carried in procession along the Nile. The Sed festival, a jubilee of renewal, where the pharaoh proved his strength before the people, even if age had already begun to weaken his body. He could not show weakness, not even once, for weakness meant doubt, and doubt meant chaos. Even his afterlife was a burden. For every pharaoh, the tomb was built in silence, hidden deep in the Valley of the Kings. But secrecy was fragile. Workers who carved the chambers were often sealed inside or sworn to silence under threat of death. Imagine knowing that your eternity was being prepared behind walls of limestone while you still walked in the sun. The gods surrounded every breath of his existence. Horus watched from the falcon's eye. Anubis lingered in the shadows. Ra blazed overhead by day, and Nut, the sky goddess, stretched her starry body above him at night. And so the pharaoh lived, not as a free man, but as a thread woven tightly into the vast fabric of eternity. And yet, through all this heaviness, there were moments of strange serenity. Sailing the Nile at sunset, the waters turning to gold, lotus flowers floating gently on the surface, hearing the music of harps and flutes drifting through palace halls, smelling the sweetness of blue lotus, the perfume of eternity. The disturbing truth remains. The pharaoh's life, though wrapped in beauty, was never his own. It belonged to Egypt, to the gods, to history itself. The life of a pharaoh was a ritual of shadows. From the moment he rose at dawn to the moment he lay down at night, every act was scripted. Every word, every gesture carried meaning. Even his clothing was symbolic. White linen, finely woven, was not just fabric. It was purity, a reflection of divine order. Golden collars, heavy with turquoise and lapis lazuli, pressed against his chest. The crook and flail, held in his hands, were not tools, but signs, symbols that he was shepherd and master, protector and punisher. Yet behind the weight of gold was the weight of expectation. The pharaoh's body itself was sacred. His hair was rarely shown, hidden beneath the blue and gold Nemez headdress. His skin was rubbed with oils, perfumed with incense, guarded against decay, even while alive. For the Egyptians feared corruption, not just in death, but in life. Every blemish, every weakness had to be hidden. And the rituals of magic were endless. Priests inscribed protective spells on papyrus scrolls, buried beneath the floors of his chambers. Amulets were sewn into his clothing, tiny scarabs of green stone, eyes of Horus in shining lapis. Even his sandals bore inscriptions, so that with each step he would trample upon the enemies of Egypt. But in the quiet hours, when torches burned low and the palace slept, there was fear. Fear of betrayal, fear of poison, fear of dreams. For in Egypt, dreams were doorways. If a pharaoh dreamt of water, it might mean blessing. If he dreamt of blood, it might mean rebellion. And always, priests were there to listen, to twist the meaning into words of power. Family, too, was no refuge. Queens, sisters, daughters, all were bound within the same web of duty and suspicion. A smile at the banquet table might hide resentment. A gift of wine might conceal venom. And the closer the bloodline, the greater the danger. For those nearest the throne were always those most tempted to seize it. The people outside the palace gates saw only grandeur. They watched the pharaoh ride in golden chariots, his head shining beneath the sun. They saw him seated in temples, larger than life, his image carved into walls of stone that reached toward the sky. But they did not see the man beneath the crown. They did not see the sleepless nights, the restless heart, the constant whispers in the dark. And always, there was the tomb, a shadow that followed him through every year, every festival, every moment of life. Deep in the cliffs, hidden passageways twisted downward into silence. Stone masons worked by torchlight, carving corridors, painting gods upon walls, inscribing spells to guide the pharaoh through the underworld. The longer he lived, the deeper the tomb grew, a house of eternity, waiting patiently for its master. The disturbing truth is not only that pharaohs lived in splendor, but that they lived as prisoners of their own divinity. Every day was a mask, every gesture a performance, every breath a reminder that he belonged to the gods first, to Egypt second, and to himself not at all. And so, as the Nile flows under the moonlight, carrying secrets to the sea, we remember the pharaohs may be gone, their palaces dust, their bodies wrapped in linen. But the echoes of their heavy lives still whisper through the desert sands. From the moment a pharaoh placed the crown upon his head, his tomb began to grow. There was the silent companion of his reign, a second palace, built not for life, but for death. The valley was quiet, hidden cliffs carved with secret doors, deep shafts descending into cool, eternal darkness. Workers labored by torchlight, chiseling limestone, painting ceilings with constellations, inscribing spells in perfect hieroglyphs. The work never stopped. Year after year, as the pharaoh ruled under the sun, his shadow home stretched deeper into the earth, waiting patiently. Mummification was the final transformation. The pharaoh was not allowed to decay, for his body was the vessel of eternity. Priests in masks of Anubis worked with solemn hands. First, the brain was removed, not through the mouth, but carefully through the nose, drawn out piece by piece with hooked tools. The heart, too, was touched with reverence, for it was believed to hold memory and morality. Sometimes it was removed. Sometimes it was left. But always it was weighed in the scales of judgment, in the imagination of the people. The body was washed in wine and water of the Nile, then coated in sacred oils, cedar, myrrh, frankincense. Linen wrappings, hundreds of yards long, were layered with care, each fold accompanied by spells whispered softly in the flickering light. Tiny amulets were tucked between the layers, scarabs for protection, ankhs for life, eyes of Horus to guard the soul's journey. The face was covered with a mask, golden, radiant, divine. It was not merely decoration, it was transformation. The human face was hidden forever, replaced with the eternal image of a god. To look upon that mask was to see not a man, but eternity itself. The tomb was filled with treasures, furniture carved from ebony and ivory, jars of wine still sealed, baskets of bread and dates, jewelry shining in the lamplight. Even small statues of servants, ushabtis, were placed beside the pharaoh. They would awaken in the afterlife, ready to serve him, just as real servants had in life. And yet, behind this beauty was fear. Fear that robbers would come, fear that the tomb would be broken, fear that eternity would be stolen in a single night. For no matter how many curses were written on the walls, no matter how many traps were hidden in the dark, greed was stronger than stone. The journey after death was long. The soul would stand before Osiris, the great judge. The heart, heavy with memory, would be placed upon a scale. On the other side, the feather of Ma'at, truth, balance, justice. If the heart was lighter, the pharaoh would pass into the eternal fields of peace. If heavier, the soul would be devoured, erased forever. Imagine living your whole life, day after day, knowing that this moment would come. Every ritual, every prayer, every offering was not just for life, but for the test after death. The pharaoh's life was bound to death from the very first breath of his reign. Every sunrise reminded him of Ra. Every sunset reminded him of Osiris. His body was not his own. His soul was not his own. His destiny was written in stone long before his final breath. Yet the Nile still flows. The desert still keeps its silence. And the golden masks of pharaohs still gaze at us across millennia, their eyes forever open, watching, waiting, reminding us that even kings, even gods on earth, were prisoners of eternity. The pharaoh was said to be eternal. But eternity was not peace. It was a burden that began in life and stretched far beyond death. In the temples, priests whispered his names, not one, but many. The secret names of the pharaoh were hidden, spoken only in ritual, for to know a name was to hold power over the soul. Even after death, his cartouche was carved into stone, circled and protected. If the name was ever erased, the soul would vanish. It was the greatest fear of all, not death, not decay, but being forgotten. And so, monuments rose higher and higher, colossal statues gazing over the Nile, walls covered in inscriptions, repeating the pharaoh's name 1,000 times. The people who bowed before them may have been long forgotten, but the pharaoh's face, carved in stone, still stares out across the desert. But even in glory, the life of a pharaoh was lonely. Imagine walking through endless halls, lined with gold, yet never truly alone, never truly trusted. Servants bowed, priests chanted, generals obeyed, but none were friends. None could speak freely, for every word was measured. every glance observed. The Pharaoh's children grew in the same shadow. Sons groomed to be heirs, watching their father, studying his every move. Daughters prepared for marriages that would bind kingdoms, or sometimes for marriages within the family, to keep the bloodline pure. Their laughter in the palace gardens was not the laughter of freedom, but of children already wearing invisible crowns. Rituals shaped their days. At dawn, offerings were placed before the gods: bread, figs, honey, beer. At midday, processions wound through the courtyards, with music, incense, and chants rising to the sky. At night, the pharaoh was bathed in warm water scented with lotus. Spells of protection were spoken before he lay down to sleep. Even in dreams, he could not escape the gods. And then, there was the land itself. The Nile was lifeblood. Its flood brought grain. Its waters brought fish. Its banks brought papyrus reeds for writing the eternal stories. The pharaoh was blamed if the river failed to rise. He was praised when its waters were generous. Every drop of water, every field of barley, was tied to his soul. Imagine carrying not only your own destiny, but the fate of every farmer, every fisherman, every child in the land of Egypt. The disturbing truth whispers softly. Pharaohs were worshipped as divine, yet trapped by divinity. Wrapped in linen, even while alive, bound by rules, by rituals, by fear of betrayal and fear of the gods. Their power was endless, and yet their freedom was none at all. And still, under the moonlight, the desert keeps their silence. The wind moves through broken temples, carrying faint echoes of prayers once whispered in the dark. If you listen closely, you might hear them still. The footsteps of priests, the murmur of the Nile, the beating of a heart weighed against eternity. Even the pharaoh's joy was bound in ritual. Festivals, though filled with music and color, were not escapes, but stages. Each one was a performance of power, a reminder that the ruler was not a man, but a bridge between heaven and earth. The Opet festival was among the grandest. In Thebes, the sacred bark of Amun was carried from Karnak to Luxor, drifting slowly along the Nile. Crowds cheered, music echoed, dancers spun in the dust. But for the pharaoh, there was not leisure. He stood beneath the burning sun, his crown heavy, his smile eternal. His presence was proof that the gods still favored Egypt, that order, Ma'at, still ruled over chaos. The Sed festival, perhaps more disturbing, came after 30 years of reign, a jubilee of renewal. By this time, the pharaoh might already be old, his body weaker, his hands trembling. But weakness could not be shown. Before the eyes of the people, he had to run, to lift offerings, to prove strength as if youth still flowed through his veins. It was theater, not truth. But in Egypt, appearances were as powerful as reality. Even leisure was strange. The pharaoh hunted lions and gazelles, not for food, but to show his mastery over nature. He played board games, Senet, a game of strategy and fate, believed to mirror the journey of the soul through the afterlife. Even his moments of rest echoed eternity. Superstition filled every shadow. A sneeze, a black cat crossing the courtyard, the sudden flight of birds. All were omens. Magicians whispered charms, carved wands of ivory to ward off demons, brewed potions from honey and herbs. In a land of gods and spirits, nothing was ordinary. Every breath, every sound was a sign. And then there were dreams. Pharaohs feared and revered them. A dream of drowning might foretell disaster. A dream of the sun rising might promise victory. Upon waking, the Pharaoh's words were recorded by scribes, pored over by priests, their meanings woven into prophecies. Imagine never closing your eyes in peace, because even sleep belonged to others. The people outside saw splendor, but within the palace, the Pharaoh lived in constant theater, where even laughter had meaning, and silence could be dangerous. And so, as the desert wind stirs across forgotten temples, we remember, pharaohs lived not as free men, but as eternal actors, bound by scripts older than time, performing for gods, for people, for history itself. The palace of a pharaoh was a house of gold, but also a house of whispers. For behind the carved walls, behind the shining columns, there was always the shadow of betrayal. Curses were not only carved on tomb walls, they lived in the pharaoh's own heart. He trusted no cup of wine, no platter of figs, no whispered word in the corridors. Even family could not be trusted. Wives, concubines, even sons could become rivals. Brothers who smiled at feasts might already be plotting. Daughters might be used as pawns in schemes of power. And so, the pharaoh surrounded himself with layers of guards, spies, and priests. Every corridor had listeners. Every banquet had tasters. Every letter was read before it touched the pharaoh's hand. It was a cage of luxury, a prison of gold. Even more unsettling was the power of curses. If a servant spoke too freely, his name could be scratched from stone, erased from memory, condemned to vanish from eternity. If an enemy was hated, magicians shaped wax figures of them, pierced with pins, and buried beneath the earth. To believe in gods was not only to pray for blessings, but also to fear their wrath. And yet, silence always remained. The pharaoh could never confess weakness. He could never admit fear. To be human was dangerous. And so he carried his burdens alone, beneath the heavy crowns of gold and blue. His final days were no gentler than his reign. As age crept into his bones, he was still lifted onto the throne, still dressed in linen, still painted with ochre, still made to look strong. Priests whispered healing spells. Physicians pressed herbs against his skin. Daughters sang lullabies in soft voices. But still, the pharaoh knew. Death was near. And yet, he was not allowed to die as a man. His final breath was a ritual. His passing was a prophecy. As the body weakened, the tomb deepened. Treasures filled chamber after chamber, and priests sharpened their knives to begin the holy work of preserving his body for eternity. The disturbing truth lingers. Pharaohs did not rule in freedom. They ruled in silence, in fear, in shadows. Their crowns were heavy with suspicion. Their beds were lined with ritual. Their hearts beat not for themselves, but for the gods, for Egypt, for eternity. Even now, when we walk among their ruins, when we gaze at broken statues and faded walls, the silence of their burden still hangs in the air. The desert remembers. The wind remembers. The Nile remembers. And through the centuries, the whisper remains. Power is never freedom, even when you are called a god. And so, the pharaoh's time came to an end. The palace grew hushed. Curtains of linen swayed in the faint desert wind. Priests in jackal masks moved silently through the corridors. Servants bowed their heads, for to look upon the dying ruler was forbidden. The air smelled of incense and myrrh, thick and heavy, as if eternity itself was already entering the room. The pharaoh's last breath was not his own. It belonged to the gods. His passing was sung as a ritual, chanted as a prayer, written down by scribes so that not even death could escape record. His body, now silent, was wrapped in oils and linen, each layer sealed with whispers of magic. The tomb, waiting for decades, opened its dark mouth. Torches flickered against painted walls, the pharaoh sailing across the heavens, the gods guiding him through gates of fire and stars. Treasures glittered in the light, golden chariots, alabaster jars, statues carved to serve forever. The mask of gold, serene and still, was lowered onto his face, erasing the man, and leaving only the god. The doors of stone closed slowly, sealing him away. Silence fell, broken only by the sound of chisels, as the workers carved the final blocks, hiding the pharaoh from the world above. Darkness embraced him, and so he passed into eternity. But eternity is heavy, for though he was wrapped in gold, though his name was carved 1,000 times, time itself whispered differently. Tomb robbers came in the night. Dynasties rose and fell. Temples crumbled into sand. And the pharaoh, once called eternal, became a shadow in history. Yet still, something remains. In the stillness of the desert, under the endless stars, the pharaoh's story lingers. His eyes, carved in stone, still gaze across the ages. His mask, silent and perfect, still meets our own. His burdens, though hidden, can still be felt in the hush of the temples and the echo of empty halls. And the disturbing truth, whispered gently now, is this. Pharaohs were called gods, yet they lived as prisoners. They were wrapped in beauty, yet weighed down by fear. Their lives were vast, yet unbearably small. And so, as you drift into sleep, let the sands of Egypt cover these memories. Let the Nile's eternal waters carry them away. Let the quiet of the desert soothe you, until even the whispers of pharaohs fade into silence. The story is done. The pharaohs rest, and so may you.